Greetings, folks, and welcome to our last lecture on Middle English. For today's talk, I've just got a handful of things that I'd like to go over with you. Just basically summing up some changes in grammar, looking at the wide variety of sources for new vocabulary coming into the language, and a little bit on word formation. In terms of grammar, of course, the most important change in English from Old English to Middle English is the loss of inflections in nouns and adjectives. This change is complete by 1500. The very complex system of case endings that we saw in Old English has by this point been reduced to what's called the zero ending, that is, no ending at all, the s or es ending in the plural, with the occasional n and en ending in the cases of strong nouns, and the s and es in the possessive, all of which still exist in modern English, with the exception, of course, that the possessive no longer has an es in terms of spelling, but does often retain it in terms of pronunciation. The same process happens with adjectives, but of course only more so. Virtually all inflections here are lost. In Old English, nouns and adjectives agreed in number, person, and gender. But by the end of the Middle English period, this agreement is simply no longer practiced. Grammatical gender is simply no longer a factor in English whatsoever, and natural gender is retained only in the personal pronouns and in the possessive adjectives, his, hers, theirs, that kind of thing. As for number, this distinction also disappears in adjectives. That is, the adjective associated with a plural noun is exactly the same as the adjective associated with a singular noun. There's simply no longer a distinction in adjectives where grammatical number is concerned, again with the exception of the possessive. So what does this look like? What does it actually mean? Well, if we slow down and just take a look at a couple of adjective-noun pairings, comparing Old English and late Middle English, say 14th century or so, then we get something that looks like this. In the case of a strong noun in Old English, such as König, we would have, running through the cases, in nominative singular, God König, in accusative singular, Godne König, genitive singular, Godes Königes, dative singular, Godum Köninge, and in instrumental singular, Gode Köninge, and in the plural, nominative Gode Köningas, in accusative Gode Köningas, in the genitive plural, Godra Köninga, and in the dative plural, Godum Köningum. This in late Middle English becomes God King, God Kinga, God Kinges, God Kinga, God Kinga, and in plural, God Kinges, God Kinges, God Kinges, and, surprise, surprise, God Kinges. And if we do the same thing all over again with a weak noun, such as nama, we end up with, again running through first the singular and then the plural, Godanama, Godannaman, 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 and Godannaman, Godannaman, Godinanamina, and Godum Namum in Old English. In late Middle English, this becomes Godnam, good name, Godnama, Godnamis, Godnamis, Godnama, and Godnamis, 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 and Godnamis. Now, one thing you might notice here in the Middle English is there are those terminal e's in some of the singular oblique cases. So in the strong nouns, in the dative and instrumental, God Kinga and God Kinga, and in the weak nouns, in the accusative and dative, God Nama, God Nama. I didn't mention those when I was talking about the loss of case endings, so I should probably say something about them now. What these are, these e's, these terminal e's that are pronounced just as the neutral vowel schwa, rather than the as they would have been pronounced in Old English, are nothing more than the remnants of the case endings that are still hanging on, but are no longer used and no longer serve any function whatsoever. So this is just the very, very end of that complex case ending system in the process of disappearing. As for why the endings disappeared, this may be a good place to sum up a couple of the reasons. One, which of course we discussed a couple of times, is the contact between Old English and Old Norse, which largely resulted in English becoming more of an analytic, less of a synthetic language, due largely to a common vocabulary, but differences in case endings. So that was a way of working out comprehension between two language groups who had a very similar vocabulary. Another reason is, and this goes back to Proto-Germanic, the shift in stress in the Germanic languages from the second or subsequent syllable to the first syllable. What that does is it de-emphasizes the case endings. And as I mentioned before, stressed syllables tend to be more fully pronounced than unstressed syllables. So when case endings became unstressed, and in Proto-Indo-European they tended to be stressed, this sort of put them into a bit of a free fall. They no longer needed to have the full pronunciation. This would account for example, in the plurals, for the es ending. So we have in Old English, in the nominative, Gode Kuningas, and in Middle English, God Kingus. So the S's, the S in the plural, is retained from the nominative and the accusative. This is where it actually comes from. This is why we have an S in the plural. But the vowel that used to be there is simply weakened because no longer fully pronounced, no longer stressed. And in virtually all cases, as I said, the distinction between weak and strong nouns also is lost, simply because there's no reason to maintain it. As for verbs, once again, we've talked about these before, but it's good to just wrap the theme up. The number of strong verbs continues to decrease. The number of weak verbs continues to increase, both by strong verbs becoming weak and by new words coming into the language as weak verbs rather than strong verbs. That is, the huge majority of borrowings are weak. Now, there are a few exceptions. For example, strive from Old French and thrive from Old Norse. But for the most part, verbs coming into the language from other languages are weak simply because the weak verb system is simpler. As things stand now, we only have 68 strong verbs left in modern English from what was once a very large strong verb system in Old English. This transformation is mostly complete by the end of the Middle English period. Now, as one final grammatical note, we should probably talk a little bit about prepositions. Middle English had a lot of prepositions, and it took them from a number of different sources. And the reason for this, and again, I've mentioned this in at least one past talk, is the collapse of the case system. That is, the cases did an important job. They let the listener or reader know what a given noun or pronoun was doing in a sentence, what its function was. And as the case endings were lost, and nouns serving any particular function tended to look more and more the same, the language needed other ways to distinguish function. The principal two ways it did that were word order, that is, becoming an analytic language, and prepositions. So here are some prepositions that we have in Middle English, where they're from, and what grammatical cases they're associated with. Now, Old English, Middle English, and Modern English had and have no prepositions associated with the nominative or accusative cases, that is, associated with being either a subject or a direct object of a verb. In the genitive, which is the possessive, there is only of, which comes from Old English of. In Modern English, we might say, for example, the building's height or the height of the building. Either one of those means exactly the same thing. And what the of does there is anchor height in the genitive case, in the possessive case. And as I said, that comes from Old English. The other really simple one is the instrumental, the case indicating agency when the agent is not the grammatical subject of the sentence. Middle English did that, and modern English does that with the preposition by, or as it would have been pronounced at the time, be, which also comes from Old English. For example, one of the sentences with which I illustrated the passive voice a couple of talks ago, I was bitten by a dog. By indicates agency, indicates instrumentality, where the doer of the action is, as I said, not the subject of the verb. This also is very simple in modern English and in Middle English because it only has the one preposition. Now, when we get to the dative, that's a mess, and there are a few reasons for this mess. As for the mess itself, the dative is, as we discussed when we were doing Old English, the catch-all case. Initially, the dative was the case of the indirect object, but as the 8 cases of Proto-Indo-European collapsed down into the 4 and a bit cases of Old English, that is, just with this little remnant of the instrumental, the dative absorbed the functions of both the ablative and the locative. What that meant was that a noun or a pronoun in the dative form could no longer reliably indicate what the dative initially had indicated, that is, being an indirect object. So even in Old English, we had a relatively large number of prepositions creeping into the dative to distinguish which function a given noun was performing. And that was when the dative was still grammatically identifiable. Well, when we move into Middle English and the dative case also pretty much disappears, we need even more prepositions to fill in that missing function, to do that job that still needs to be done. A number of these prepositions, of course, simply survive from Old English. That's the largest number of them. And most of these we still have in modern English. Aboven, afore, after, on, be as in beside, before, beside, betwixen, between, dun, into, mid, onto, umbe, unto, upon, with oten. The only one we don't use anymore is umbe. But we also took on prepositions from Old Norse, as you might expect, because of course Old Norse and Old English had been in intimate contact for quite some time. So at, fra, till, and with come from Old Norse. And following on the Norman conquest, as you would expect, prepositions also start creeping in from French. So aboard, contre, durant, except, and sans. We still have aboard, during, and except. And we use contre and sans in particular situations as well. Not very often, but they're still present. So that is the preposition system that modern English has. Looks very, very familiar by the time we reach the end of the Middle English period, or even by the time we're well into the Middle English period. Now, one little almost joke of etymology, and I discussed this in the tutorial group a couple of weeks ago, but of course not everybody was there, is the preposition with. Because of course, our preposition with, the modern English preposition with, which is also the Middle English preposition with, comes from Old Norse, and it means roughly accompanying. But the word with, the preposition with, did exist in Old English, but it meant something completely different. Consider, for example, to withhold or withstand. To withstand is to stand against. To withhold is to keep from, to hold from. So with in Old English indicates opposition, whereas with in Middle and Modern English, coming from Old Norse, indicates accompaniment. The word that Old English used to indicate accompaniment, the preposition rather, that Old English used to indicate accompaniment was mid, cognate with German mit. And it simply means with in the modern sense. Well, what this means is that we have an Old English with that means against and a modern English with that means with. So you actually can say in English, you're either with us or with us, and at least in theory, be stating an opposition. Anyways, I think that's enough on grammar for now. So we're going to move on to vocabulary. As you might expect, the principal influence, the principal characteristic of vocabulary change in Middle English is the influx of words from French and Latin. We've already talked about this a fair bit. Within this context, one of the most important influences is actually the poet Geoffrey Chaucer. So a little bit of history here. Chaucer was, aside from being simply a wonderful and at times hilarious poet, a person who was very well connected. He was associated with the royal house. He was effectively a court poet. He was good friends with John of Gaunt, third surviving son of Edward III, who, though while never king, was for a considerable period probably the most powerful person in the kingdom, and the person from whom all subsequent monarchs are descended. Chaucer was also multilingual. He read, aside from English, he read French, Latin, and Italian, and he was comfortable with the poetry of French, Latin, and Italian, as well as the poetry of English. He spent some time as a prisoner of war in France during the 100 Years' War and was ransomed back, I believe by John of Gaunt. While he was in France, he of course had access to a library. And what Chaucer does in much of his poetry is import words whenever he thinks they might come in handy. In fact, I don't think anyone is responsible for coining more words in English than Chaucer, with the exception of Shakespeare. That's how much of an influence he's actually had on our language. And the reason for this habit, well, there are a couple of reasons for it. One, he saw the language as it stood, the language in which he wanted to write serious poetry, as being deficient. And the natural place to borrow words was, of course, French, and to a lesser degree Italian, the languages whose poetries, the vernacular languages whose poetries he saw as being more fully mature, because at that time, quite frankly, they were. So Chaucer will very often pull a French word into English, and the only difference is that it's now pronounced like a Middle English word instead of like a French word, but the pronunciations even there are relatively similar. What Chaucer also does, and this is something that's already present in the language, is he quite consciously distinguishes between social registers by using either Anglo-Saxon or French vocabulary, with, of course, French hitting the higher register and Anglo-Saxon words hitting the lower register. He does this with poetics as well. The Canterbury Tales is written in rhyming iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter, from the later Middle Ages onward for a number of centuries, becomes the prestige meter of English poetry in the way that hexameter is the prestige meter of both Greek and Latin poetry. Well, the habit of writing rhyming poetry, as I've mentioned before, comes out of French. Native English poetry was alliterative, and there was still, as I mentioned before, alliterative poetry being composed in the north of England at this time. What used to be called the alliterative revival, and could more accurately be called the alliterative survival. But as with vocabulary, poetics also hit different social registers for Chaucer. He actually makes fun of the northern alliterative tradition. He has one character, for example, I believe it's the Reeve in the Canterbury Tales, say, "I can no rum ram ruff." That is, I don't know rum ram ruff. I don't know alliterative poetry. I don't do that. So I'm going to tell you a story in rhyme. The Reeve's a cranky bugger. And what Chaucer also does, and I believe he's the first English poet to do so, is he writes in dialect. He indicates some degree of hickishness by having a character speak a northern dialect, by having a character speak a dialect infused with Anglo-Saxon words and, as he would see, deficient in French words. He's a brilliant poet, a wonderful poet, and if you have not read the Canterbury Tales, you really ought to, just for their own sake. They're wonderful. But as this is a course in language history and not in poetry, I'm going to move on to a more specifically linguistic question. One interesting facet of English borrowing from French is that we can often tell, relative to how it's pronounced, when a word came from French into English. And the reason for this is that Old French, of course, was undergoing its own sound changes. Every language is always in a state of flux, every living language anyways, as of course was Anglo-Norman. But these two language communities, these two speech communities, having been effectively separate from each other from the 11th century on, were on different trajectories. So changes that happened in Old French on the continent didn't necessarily happen in Anglo-Norman and vice versa. What this means is that there are instances where Anglo-Norman is more conservative. It preserves an older pronunciation, whereas Old French develops pronunciations that are still retained in modern French. To put this in a concrete context, Old French on the continent, by the end of the 12th century, has lost the s sound when it occurs before other consonants. So the modern English word feast, which comes from Middle English feste, is a borrowing from Anglo-Norman feste, which in turn retains an earlier pronunciation from Old French. But in modern French, that word has become fête. The S is lost. So in this sense, the English word feast is actually closer to Old French than the French word fête. We can see this in a number of other modern English, modern French pairings. For example, modern English forest and modern French forêt, modern English hostel and modern French hôtel, modern English beast and modern French bête. In all of those cases, the Anglo-Norman word, from which the modern English word comes, preserves the older French pronunciation, whereas the modern French word is a result of the loss of that S before the subsequent consonant. What you can also see then in hostel and hôtel is that English has taken both of those words over, but at different times. We've had hostel for a longer time than we've had hotel. And we can tell this by the presence of that S before the T. Because, of course, by the end of the Middle English period, English was no longer taking words from Anglo-Norman, but did continue taking words from continental French. Other instances of this same type of transformation, the same type of linguistic change, are the change in Old French, but not in Anglo-Norman, from ch to sh, and from j to zh. In both cases, the unvoiced and the voiced, a consonant consisting of a plosive and a sibilant, simply loses the plosive element. And simply looking at these sounds, we can tell, relative to each other, when specific words came from French into English. So early words, taken from Old Norman, would be charge, change, chamber, chase, chair, and chimney, whereas the later borrowings, chamois, chaperon, chiffon, and chevron, have partaken of that transformation in Old French that Anglo-Norman did not participate in. Similarly, if we want to take a look at the vocal version of that consonant, we have the earlier words coming from Anglo-Norman, just, jewel, journey, majesty, gentle, but the later borrowing rouge coming from continental French. But of course, French isn't the only language from which English takes words. Latin also, as you might expect, still plays a major role. Largely this is to do with the influence of the church. So we have words coming in from the field of theology. Wycliffe, for example, the translator of the Bible into Middle English, is responsible for over 1,000 borrowings. And because the church was also the center of education, any learned terms coming into fields of study such as law, medicine, science, what have you, these would also be taken from Latin because, as we've discussed already, Old English, while it did have a vocabulary capable of handling any of those fields, was basically decapitated at the time of the Norman Conquest. So all of those functions had to be built back into the language if it was going to be able to perform the function of a fully fledged language of literature and learning. Latin also in the Middle Ages was a spoken language. As I think I mentioned in our last tutorial session, Latin was not a dead language in the Middle Ages as it is now. Though it was nobody's first language, it was the spoken language of the monasteries. You would converse in Latin with your fellow monks. And it was very often the language of instruction at universities, though by the end of the Middle English period, this has tapered. Initially, of course, the big universities were associated with the church, Oxford and Cambridge respectively. And their language of instruction and language of administration would have been Latin. So simply by the use of Latin as a living rather than merely fossil language, in a context in which knowledge is being developed and propagated, you are going naturally to have Latin terms creeping into the language from those sources. In fact, poetry continued to be composed in Latin right up through the end of the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. John Gower, for example, a contemporary of Chaucer, and I believe a friend of Chaucer's actually, composed major works of poetry in all three of the literary languages of England, English, French, and Latin. And speaking of poetry, this is also a major area of borrowing from Latin. And it's done quite self-consciously from about the 15th century. Many of the terms that come into the language through this avenue are referred to as aureate terms, and the process is referred to as gilding. This is often a disparagement. On the one hand, it is part of the self-conscious reestablishment of English as a language of literature that deserves to be seen on a par with the literatures of, say, French and Italian. But on the other hand, it is often taken to the extent where it comes across as being self-consciously artificial. So there's this desire to, on the one hand, elevate the language, and on the other, there's a degree to which the language of literature or the language of self-consciously literary or high culture constructions comes to be distanced from what might seem a more natural use of the language. This tension exists to this day, and it's something we're going to be tracing throughout the modern period in various contexts. A group of late medieval poets called the Scottish Chaucerians, associated with the court at Edinburgh, poets such as Dunbar and Henryson, were very fond of this particular practice. They, of course, were called Scottish Chaucerians because they were not just influenced by Chaucer, but in some cases went on to write continuations of Chaucer's works. If you want to read a really interesting one of these, read Henryson's Testament of Cressida, a continuation of Troilus and Crusades, which is Chaucer's first major literary work. Henryson is a cranky bugger as well, and he gives Crusade, whom he does not like, leprosy. So yeah, he's a barrel of laughs. If you're going to read one of the Scottish Chaucerians after you've read some Chaucer, read Henryson. I think you'll enjoy him. But what does all this abstract stuff mean? Well, if we put it just in concrete terms of language we actually speak, it works like this. We've already spoken of English-French doubling, with the French terms tending to hit a higher social register than the English terms. Now we're going to take that one step further. That is, there are in English a great many English-French-Latin triplets, in which we have words from English, words from French, and words from Latin, meaning about the same thing, but hitting different social registers, with the English always registering lowest and the Latin always registering highest. That is, going from popular, what we might call, to literary, to learned language. Everyday, to the language of writing, to the language of intellectual discourse. So here we have, for example, rise, mount, and ascend. Ask, question, interrogate. Goodness, virtue, probity. Fire, flame, conflagration. Fear, terror, trepidation. Holy, sacred, consecrated. Time, age, and epoch. And as we look at these words, we can also, for the most part, keep them in the same order if we're ranking them in terms of how long they've been in the language. This is not always the case, but it's a tendency. The English are always going to be the oldest words. The words coming from French will usually be next up, and the words coming from Latin will usually be the most recent in those particular triplets, or in English, French, Latin triplets generally. Don't take that to the bank. It's not an absolute rule. It's just a tendency, but it's reasonably reliable. And this reflects the culture of the later Middle Ages, doesn't it? The English words for basic functions never went away. We still have them. We use them all the time. But the literary terms coming out of French are perfectly consistent with a culture in which English is no longer seen as a literary language, which was the case for the bulk of the Middle English period. On the other hand, because Latin is the language of learning and diplomacy and religion and philosophy in the Middle Ages, you would expect exactly those most prestigious words in the language coming from that time to come from Latin. And we still have a sense, I think, that saying something in Latin involves, if not a conferring of dignity to it, at least a self-conscious attempt to confer dignity to it. Now, that can be very easily parodied, and often should be, but even in satire, even in parody, the impulse is still recognizable. This goes back to the later Middle Ages. But of course, there are other languages as well, and other language communities, other speech communities, with which England and English speakers came into contact. One of the most prominent of these is the cluster of languages, Low German, Dutch, and Flemish, all at the time probably mutually comprehensible, still largely mutually comprehensible. And the nature of this interaction was largely one of trade. There was actually a fairly substantial community of particularly Flemish people, living in England during the later Middle Ages. So a lot of our words coming from this language cluster tend to involve seamanship. Naturally, you get to the Low Countries by boat, and they're pretty good sailors, and trade, so commodities and storage implements and that kind of thing. So this is where we get words, for example, such as halibut, boom as in the boom of a ship, pump, shore, skipper, bundle, bung, dowel, firkin, and even such common words as clock, damp, grime, splinter, wriggle. All of these come from the Low German languages, to which English is, of course, closely related. And this may actually have made it easier for those words to find it into English. There's a similar sound system involved between English and the continental Germanic languages, or at least there was up until the early modern period. A couple I'd like to look at right now, just to give you an example, are the English word groove, first attested in 1400 as grove, meaning a cave or a pit, which comes from the Middle Dutch grove, meaning a ditch or a furrow, like the kind of furrow that you would have on a farm. And by 1659, this word has come to mean what we now mean by groove. But it's also cognate with the Old English graf, which is where we get our word grave. And this is a nice instance of words from a common ancestry going off on their own separate trajectories, and then coming back into the language, but doing different jobs. I find that kind of thing utterly fascinating. Another word I'd like to pay some attention to here is hops. We get our word hops from Dutch. Its first attestation in English is in 1440, hoppe, from Middle Dutch hoppe. And these, of course, are the herbs we use for preserving and flavoring beer. And this is interesting, I find, because hops have become such an integral part of of the understanding of what beer is, basically you need 4 ingredients to make beer: water, malted barley, yeast, and hops, that it's easy to forget that these are relatively recent. Beer has existed since the beginning of the agricultural age for thousands of years, but we've only been flavoring it with hops for a few hundred. So the beer of the Middle Ages would have tasted very, very different from the beer of the modern period. They would have used different herbs to flavor it. They would have used fruit very often, and a variety of spices. And I guess it's the fact that I do a lot of my own brewing that drives my interest in this one. In any case, I've posted handouts to our Moodle page that gives you a fairly substantial sense of the kinds of words, and in some cases their etymologies, coming into English from Dutch. So I'd encourage you to have a look over those, and perhaps we can talk about them in our tutorial on Friday. But there were other languages as well, and quite a few of them. While English doesn't have that many words from the various Celtic languages, for example, it does have a few. Bard, bray, bug, crag, I believe. And of course, we have a fair bit coming in from Greek as well. Other languages that contribute to the English lexicon during the later Middle Ages include Persian, Hebrew, Slavic, Hungarian, Arabic, and some for which we don't even know their identities. Now, I've supplied you with a little handout giving you examples of a few of these, so I'm not going to go into the details here, but again, I'm hoping we can maybe talk about this a little bit in Friday's tutorial session. But there are a few that I'd like to highlight just for our purposes at the moment. The first is words that we've had coming in from Arabic. This, of course, is largely because of the Crusades. But the nature of a lot of the words coming in from Arabic reveal a lot about the cultures, of course, and their intellectual and cultural achievements relative to each other. A lot of our words from mathematics come from Arabic. And it's easy in the modern world to forget, especially because there are powerful cultural mechanisms that encourage us to forget, that for a long time, while the world of Western Europe was basically an intellectual backwater, and that covers almost the entire Middle Ages, the Arabic world was a center of learning. Principal advances in the sciences, in mathematics, and in architecture often came out of the Arabic world. So words such as azimuth, which is the angular distance of a particular point above the horizon, or nadir, or average, these indicate a level of intellectual activity in the Arabic world that surpassed what the West was doing at the time. In fact, it's not really until the early modern period that what we think of as the West starts becoming anything like an intellectual powerhouse. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that sudden upsurge in knowledge when we get to the early modern period next week. The other principal route for words coming in from Arabic would, of course, have been Spain, wouldn't it? Because for much of the Middle Ages, most of the Middle Ages, the Iberian Peninsula, or a substantial chunk of the Iberian Peninsula, was a part of the Muslim world. And this source was a huge influence not just on our vocabulary, but on literature, not just as a location to set literary conflict, as in, for example, with the French chanson de geste, but also with genres of literature coming into the so-called Western world. There would probably not be a romance genre. There would probably not be a genre of troubadour poetry if not for the Muslim presence in Spain, if not for the Arabic culture influencing Spain. But as I said, there are strong cultural mechanisms very much at work today that encourage us to forget our indebtedness to the Arabic world, to the Muslim world. Good to bear that in mind. Another item of interest that I wanted to just touch upon in this little talk is the number of words whose origins we don't know, the number of everyday words that we just don't know where they came from. Words like bicker, big boy, clasp, junk, Kidney, lass, noose, puzzle, roam, slender, throb, wallet. These are all everyday words, and we just don't know where they came from. Does this mean that there's language contacts with languages that we haven't identified that are involved here? Possible, maybe. Or is it that these words may have come into use via channels that we haven't identified and undergone, therefore, transformations that we haven't identified? In some cases, it may be one. In some cases, it may be another. I don't know. And that great big I don't know, that question mark that hangs over many of our common words is again, a source of perpetual fascination for me. I'm curious. And the fact that we still don't know where some of our most basic words come from is just, quite frankly, fun. It's a reminder of how much of the things we take for granted are words. Our words are a very intimate part of us. It's a reminder of how much of that, how many of those, are still kind of a mystery to us. What we do have a fair understanding of, though, are the ways in which word formation strategies changed over the course of the Middle English period. Now, you remember we discussed Old English word formation strategies, which mostly consisted of affixing, that is either prefixing or suffixing, and compounding, that is mashing two words together to make a new word. During the Middle English period, again, as we've already discussed, borrowing tends to displace compounding, this having to do with the relative statuses of English and French during the Norman period, and the fact that English words for discourses of administration, military command, social structure, philosophy, theology, all of that were just done away with. They had no place. They all vanished and had to be replaced by French imports. But that said, affixing also underwent some interesting changes. It continued to be practiced and continues to be practiced. So we still use prefixes and suffixes to make new words. But from the Middle English period on, we use not just native English prefixes and suffixes, but also their French counterparts. So this is a situation very much, I suppose, similar to what we saw with the prepositions, the influx of prepositions during the Middle English period. And when we look at these, so some interesting patterns emerge. So if we take a look at common Old English prefixes, and I'll just use the modern English pronunciations, be, for, with, to, un. We tack those on to the beginnings of words to make new words in ways that we've already actually discussed. But we also now use words that have come in from French: contra, counter, re, pre, con, de, dis, en, ex, pre, pro, and trans. And these continue to be active in the language. That is, these are part of our mechanisms right to this day for making new words. And a similar situation exists with suffixes. So we have the native English suffixes ness, full, less, some, ish, lock, red, dome, most of which we still use, some of which we don't. But these are augmented with the French suffixes able or ible, ance or ence, ant or ent, esque, itty, iv, ment, us, and shun. Now, what I find interesting about both these French prefixes and these French suffixes coming into the language is that they've been so naturalized into English that they don't seem in any way foreign. They're simply part of our word formation mechanisms now, and culturally have become, I guess you might say, value neutral. So whereas a lot of our French words with their English counterparts have a slightly higher social status, the same doesn't seem to be the case with our affixes. But perhaps a concrete example will illustrate better what I mean. Take a look, for example, at the words on this slide. And for clarity, I've color-coded the elements of English and French origin respectively to be blue and red, and put the affixes in bold and the root words in italics. So the first section, the first item there, is befool, besiege, and beguile. Now these are all words that are made by tacking an English prefix onto a French root. And they fit so well together that when we look at them, they don't seem in any way incompatible. They're quite naturalized to that degree that they're really indistinguishable one from the other in terms of everyday use, everyday sense of how they feel. On the other hand, if we take a look at the second list item, we have knowable, findable, speakable, doable, makeable. And for simplicity, I've just stuck with a narrow selection of prefixes and suffixes. But here we have a French suffix or a French affix, specifically a suffix, added on to an English root word. So French elements can be added to the English bits, or English elements can be added to the French bits. And there's no sense of disjuncture. There's no sense of dissonance in the weaving together of these language elements here. And we can even take a single root and add affixes of both French and English origin. So, for example, unknowable. And again, these affixes coming out of French have been so completely assimilated into English that there is no detectable difference really between them and native English affixes. It's little details like that, as with our use of Old Norse personal pronouns that indicate the intimacy of language contact here, the degrees to which not just our vocabulary, but our grammatical and lexical mechanisms themselves have been influenced by languages other than English. Another word formation strategy that is new to the Middle English period is clipping, defined as subtracting one or more syllables from a word. And this is something we do with a lot of words borrowed from French. Clipping as well is something that we still do. And in fact, we do, I think, at an accelerated rate compared to how it was done in the Middle Ages, probably because we just feel like we're in more of a hurry. When I was in high school, for example, I didn't go to the cafeteria, I went to the caf. We abbreviate things all the time. Now, getting back to the Middle English period, quite a few very common words entered English from French by chopping bits off of the original French words, which in some cases also survive in English. As for why clipping tended to happen during the Middle English period, specifically with words coming from French, French and English have different stress patterns. In English, stress tends to fall on the first syllable. In French, stress tends to fall on the second syllable. So an English speaker hearing a French word is likely to just skip over the first syllable entirely, because doing so helps the word conform to the internalized natural speech patterns of the English language, of the English speaker. Now, as I said, very often both forms survive. And my suspicion is that where both forms survive, the clipped version entered the language primarily through speech, and the unclipped version entered the language primarily through writing, where, of course, the eye and not the ear is the point of contact where language is concerned. So let's take a look at a few examples and then wrap up today's little talk. We have, for example, our word fray, which is abbreviated from affray, from Old French, affray. While fray is fairly common, affray is not quite so common in contemporary English, but we still do have it. Same with squire and esquire from Old French esquire. And I pronounced the R there because in Old French it would have been pronounced when it came into the language. These words have similar meanings, don't they? A squire is a person who's not quite a knight. That is a very low level of the nobility. In the process of becoming a knight, the last stage before knighthood is being a squire. We still have that expression, a country squire, a gentleman who lives in the country, and there's something rural about the term, something accessible about the term. Esquire, on the other hand, which is closer to the original source, is also a slightly higher level of diction, I think. In the 19th century, it tended to be used if you were to write your name so-and-so. If I were to write my name Roger Wilkie, Esquire, it would suggest that I was, on the one hand, reasonably comfortable, reasonably well-to-do, but also was of no fixed profession. So an esquire is, in that sense, a well-to-do, fashionable young man. That might be one way of looking at the contemporary usage of the word. And I suppose the title of the magazine, Esquire, kind of gives that away. Similarly, we have stress coming from distress, coming from Old French, destresse, which could be spelled a few different ways. Now, in this case, the meanings, again, are still quite close, but distress seems to be more imminent, more intense, I think. And similarly, we have peel coming from appeal, coming from Old French appel, or mend coming from amend, coming from Old French amender. But as I said a moment ago, my suspicion is that the abbreviated, the clipped versions of these words came into the language primarily orally through spoken communication. And the unclipped versions of these words came in primarily through written communication, through written sources. This is an interesting way of viewing language, or an interesting avenue into language as a physical, as a physiological phenomenon, rather than some abstraction that we can simply sit back and cogitate about. The mechanisms for language are all physical mechanisms, and the mechanisms by which language enters and the mechanisms by which language is produced will impact how the language sounds, how the language functions. I hadn't planned on talking about that today, so I'm not going to go down that particular rabbit hole at the moment. I think instead I'll probably just wrap up for now. And that just about wraps up our unit on Middle English and on the medieval period as a whole. I think what I might do tomorrow is post a few readings tracing the sound of English from the Old English period up to late Middle English, so you can actually hear the evolution of the language over a relatively short period of time. This is something I usually do live in classes, but of course we're not having live classes now, so the best I can do is just record it. At least then I'll be able to cut out my mistakes. In any case, I do look forward to talking with you on Friday, those of you who come to the tutorial. Bring your questions, as always, and failing that, of course, we can just talk about some of the vocabulary items that I posted on the Moodle page. For next week, please read the first chapter on the early modern period. And as that is a brand new period, I'll probably do the first lecture on Monday as a historical introduction. And then probably the next thing I get into will be the Great Vowel Shift. So that'll be what's on the menu or on the agenda for the next couple of talks. Thank you as always for listening, and I'll see you on Friday. Bye for now.